The fountain pen hovered exactly 1 inch above the parchment, but to Kaelen Morrix it felt as heavy as a headstone. He could feel the phantom weight of 3 decades of violence pressing down on his knuckles, a cold blade of his own making held against his throat. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 40th floor boardroom, blurring the world outside into a drowning, relentless gray. Inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke, a suffocating cocktail of expensive Italian leather, sandalwood cologne, and the sharp metallic tang of an ending. Across the mahogany table, Orrin Vexley and Male Croswick watched him with the silent, patient hunger of vultures circling a dying beast. It had taken only months for the Morrix legacy to reach this precipice, months of cleaning up loose ends, of quiet whispers in back alleys, and the systematic dismantling of the empire his predecessors had carved out of the city with iron and blood. Now it was all slipping through his fingers like river water. Kaelen's gaze was fixed on the signature line, the final ink trap that would seize the Harton farm and erase the last of his conscience. His tattooed hand, knuckles scarred by 1,000 bad decisions and dragon scales rippling toward his cuff, gripped the pen so hard the barrel groaned. Sweat gathered at his temple, cold despite the climate control. This was the moment. Sign the redevelopment agreement, hand the widow's land over to Vexley's front company, and walk away with his kingdom intact. His associates had spent weeks whispering the same poison. It's just business. We protect the organization. We preserve the power. Kaelen's hand began its final descent toward the paper, the final ink trap that would seize the Harton farm and erase the last of his conscience. His tattooed hand, knuckles scarred by 1,000 bad decisions and dragon scales rippling toward his cuff, gripped the pen so hard the barrel groaned. Sweat gathered at his temple, cold despite the climate control. This was the moment. Sign the redevelopment agreement, hand the widow's land over to Vexley's front company, and walk away with his kingdom intact. His associates had spent weeks whispering the same poison. It's just business. We protect the organization. We preserve the power. Kaelen's hand began its final descent toward the paper, the final ink trap that would seize the Harton farm and erase the last of his conscience. His tattooed hand, knuckles scarred by 1,000 bad decisions and dragon scales rippling toward his cuff, gripped the pen so hard the barrel groaned. Sweat gathered at his temple, cold despite the climate control. The Mont Blanc fountain pen hovered exactly 1 inch above the parchment, but to Kaelen Morrix it felt as heavy as a granite headstone. He could feel the phantom weight of 3 decades of violence pressing down on his knuckles, a cold blade of his own making held against his throat. Rain hammered the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 40th floor boardroom, blurring the Seattle skyline into a drowning, relentless gray. Inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke, a suffocating cocktail of expensive Italian leather, sandalwood cologne, and the sharp metallic tang of a dying empire. Across the mahogany table, Orrin Vexley and Male Croswick watched him with the silent, patient hunger of vultures circling a wounded beast. It had taken only 3 months for the Morrix legacy to reach this precipice, 3 months of hemorrhaging liquidity, of territories going dark, and the systematic dismantling of the kingdom his father had built with blood and brutality. Now the docks and the shipping lanes were all slipping through his fingers like river water. Kaelen's gaze was fixed on the signature line, the final ink trap that would seize the Harton farm and erase the last of his conscience. His tattooed hand, knuckles scarred by 1,000 bad decisions and dragon scales rippling toward his cuff, gripped the pen so hard the barrel groaned. Sweat gathered at his temple, cold despite the aggressive air conditioning. His throat worked as he stared at the insolvency agreement. This was the moment. Sign the redevelopment papers, transfer the assets to Vexley's front company, and walk away into exile. His associates had spent weeks whispering the same poison. It was the only way to save the men and preserve what was left of the legacy. Kaelen ignored the desperation thick in the air, trying to convince himself that survival was worth the cost of his soul. Kaelen's hand began its final jagged descent toward the paper, the point of no return. He was seconds away from taking everything the widow owned, finalizing a theft 30 years in the making. The pen tip nearly grazed the line when the double doors at the back of the room swung open and a silver tray crashed to the floor with the violence of a gunshot. The heavy, earthy scent of a home-cooked stew, savory, humble, and hauntingly familiar, cut through the sterile boardroom air like a divine interruption. Kaelen stared at the ceramic bowl, the steam curling into the sterile air. The peppery scent of the stew was a violent intrusion, a covenant flavor that tore through 30 years of scar tissue to find the boy he used to be. Across the table, the lawyers and elders remained frozen, their patient hunger replaced by the sharp sting of an interrupted kill. "Sir, don't," Nyelle whispered. Her hand was firm against the mahogany, her fingers splayed across the signature line as if she were shielding a body from a bullet. Up close, Kaelen saw the fierce, intelligent urgency in her eyes that didn't see a mob boss, but a man about to step off a cliff. He didn't pull away. He looked from her trembling fingers to the fine print she was anchored to. "Clause 88C, she said, her voice dropping to a low surgical hum that cut through the hammering rain. "The routing number isn't for an escrow account. It's a direct link to a prosecution fund." Kaelen felt the room go cold. He had been told this deal would preserve his men and protect the widow's legacy. Instead, Nyelle was showing him a death sentence hidden in plain sight. The realization was a blade against his throat. His associates, Male and Oren, weren't liquidating assets to save the syndicate. They were feeding him to the feds so they could seize the widow's land for their own industry of nightmares. Kaelen's grip on the Mont Blanc pen loosened until it clattered onto the contract. He snapped his head up, his gaze heavy with a suppressed rage that made the lawyers recoil. He looked at Nyelle, the invisible waitress who possessed the only truth in a room full of lies. She had risked everything to stop a predator, and in the reflection of the glass walls, Kaelen saw the dragon finally begin to crack. He wasn't signing a paper, he was deciding if he still had a soul worth saving. The heavy, peppery steam from the stew acted as a key, unlocking a vault in Kaelen's mind that had been sealed with ice and iron for 30 years. He looked past the surgical precision of Nyelle's fingers to the name on the deed, Harton. The name didn't just represent a piece of land to be seized, it was a ghost of a covenant he had broken. His mind raced back to a winter so cold it had felt like a bruise, to a woman who had seen a starving boy instead of a future predator and offered him the only warmth she possessed, a bowl of this exact stew. The woman who had fed him was gone, but the widow he was currently crushing was her daughter. The realization hit Kaelen with the force of a blade against his throat, more painful than any physical wound. He wasn't just expanding an empire, he was robbing his own past and the very hands that had kept him alive when the world had turned its back. The expensive cologne and leather of the boardroom suddenly smelled like rot. Kaelen's tattooed hand began to shake, the dragon scales on his skin feeling like lead. He looked at the widow's signature, already shaky and tear-stained, and then at Nyelle and Oren. His associates sat with silent hunger, their faces masks of corporate greed as they waited for him to finalize the theft. They didn't see a legacy. They saw renewable inventory and a billion-dollar payday built on the ashes of a defenseless woman. "I know this family," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a low, rough vibration that made the air in the room tighten. The lawyers exchanged a shocked glance, but Kaelen was looking only at Nyelle. She stood her ground, her fierce, intelligent eyes reflecting a spark of the girl she'd been before the world tried to destroy her. She knew exactly who he was, and yet she had served him the truth on a silver tray. Kaelen pushed the contract away, the heavy Mont Blanc pen rolling across the mahogany like a discarded weapon. The vultures began to stir, sensing a change in the wind, but the dragon had finally stopped looking at the numbers and started looking at his soul. Kaelen's scarred hand didn't move toward the pen. Instead, it gripped the edge of the mahogany table until the wood groaned. The warmth of the stew still lingered in the air, a covenant scent that made the sterile boardroom feel like a crime scene. He turned his gaze toward Orrin Vexley and Male Croswick, whose patient hunger had shifted into a twitchy, defensive stillness. Nyelle didn't back away. She stepped closer, her fierce, intelligent urgency guiding his eyes back to the documents. "Look past the routing numbers, Mr. Morrix," Nyelle whispered, her voice a surgical strike against the silence. "Look at the zoning addendum in Clause 92. Kaelen flipped the heavy parchment, his tattooed knuckles white as he scanned the technical jargon. Beneath the talk of redevelopment and logistics, a secondary agreement was buried like a blade against his throat. It was a purchase order for industrial-grade refrigeration units and medical equipment that had no place on a farm. The realization hit Kaelen with a sharp, metallic tang of desperation. The land wasn't being seized for expansion. It was being converted into a viper's nest for organ harvesting. His father had built an empire on blood and brutality, but there were rules. No children, no women, no floating butcher shops. Orrin and Male hadn't just siphoned his money, they were liquidating the syndicate's soul for $1 billion payday that would turn the Morrix name into a global industry of nightmares. "You were turning my legacy into a slaughterhouse," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a low, rough vibration that made the glass walls rattle against the rain. The vultures at the table didn't flinch. They looked at him with flat, empty eyes, already calculating the cost of his silence. Male adjusted his tie, the expensive cologne on his wrists suddenly smelling like rot. Kaelen looked at Nyelle, the invisible waitress who had just started a war to save a man she should hate. He realized he had been holding a knife to his own throat, ready to sign away his freedom to the very men who were bleeding him dry. The dragon didn't just feel anger, he felt a profound rage that made the air in the room feel dangerous. He pushed the chair back, the screech of metal against marble sounding like a gunshot, and for the first time in 30 years, Kaelen Morrix stopped being a predator and began to look for a way to be human. Kaelen stared at the Viper Logistics logo on the contract, but he no longer saw a business deal. He saw a confession written in the blood of the innocent. The expensive cologne and leather of the boardroom became a tomb, and for the first time in his 30-year reign, the weight of 500 lives shifted. It was no longer a currency of power he wielded over the city, but a blade against his throat, cold and demanding. The dragon scales on his neck felt like leaden chains, marking him not as a predator, but as a man who had casually destroyed a future he never bothered to understand. His throat worked as a profound inner collapse began, a structural failure of the soul that made the 40th floor boardroom feel like it was free-falling. He looked at Nyelle, whose fierce, intelligent eyes held a mirror to his own monstrosity. She wasn't just a waitress, she was the prodigy his own organization had paid to eliminate because she saw the truth buried in the numbers. He had signed budgets for external risk removal as easily as breathing, never realizing those signatures were death sentences for scholarship students and grieving widows. The sharp metallic tang of desperation was no longer coming from the failing syndicate accounts, but from the hollow space where his honor used to live. Kaelen realized he had been holding a knife to his own throat, blinded by a traditional loyalty to men like Nyelle and Oren, who were bleeding him dry to fund an industry of nightmares. The covenant he had broken 30 years ago roared in his ears, louder than the rain hammering the glass walls. "I've spent 8 years proving I was a dragon," Kaelen whispered, his voice low and rough with a grief that offered no sanctuary. "But I was just a line item in my uncle's ledger." He felt a profound rage and a crushing shame, realizing that while he trusted his family, they were preparing to turn his father's shipping fleet into floating butcher shops. The collapse was complete. The Dragon of Seattle was dead. In his place sat a man carrying weight he couldn't set down, finally ready to become human, even if it meant burning his kingdom to ash. The black Tahoe surged through the rain and darkness, its tires churning the mud of the narrow mountain road that led towards the Harton farm. Beside Kaelen, Nyelle sat rigid, her hands white-knuckled on the laptop that held the digital kill switch for his uncle's empire. Kalen's breathing was shallow, his side burning from the ragged gash where Quan's knife had caught him, but he refused to slow down. He wasn't approaching these gates with the patient hunger of a vulture anymore. He was a man driving directly into the eye of the storm he had spent 8 years building. The farmhouse appeared through the mist like a ghost of a forgotten covenant. It was a structure of glass and dark wood that should have represented sanctuary, but tonight it was a viper's nest. Kaelen could see the shadows of at least 3 men moving through the trees, sentries his uncle had placed to ensure the renewable inventory didn't escape. The sharp metallic tang of desperation filled the cabin as Kaelen pulled the handgun from his waistband, his tattooed hands steady despite the exhaustion carved into his face. "Stay close to me," he whispered to Nyelle, his voice low and rough. "If anything happens, you run. Don't look back." He realized with a cold, crawling certainty that he was no longer the dragon protecting a hoard of stolen gold. He was a man willing to bleed for the innocent to stop a factory of nightmares. They stepped out into the sharp and cold mountain air, the scent of pine mixed with the oily smell of the armored vehicles parked in the shadows. Kaelen didn't feel like a conqueror. He felt the weight of 500 lives pressing down on him, not as a currency of power, but as a blade against his throat demanding restitution. He looked at Nyelle, the fierce and brilliant woman who had forced him to become human, and together they walked toward the house to face the monsters he had once called family. Kaelen stepped into the warm glow of the farmhouse, the heated floors radiating through his boots, but the air inside was heavy with the thunk of bulletproof steel and the scent of betrayal. Standing in the center of the room was Quan, the man who had been like a brother, his flat, empty eyes now fixed on Kaelen with the patient hunger of a vulture. Behind him stood a dozen enforcers, the tattooed predators Kaelen had personally led, their weapons raised and ready to silence a witness. "Minho pays better, boss," Quan said, his voice calm, almost gentle, as he aimed his suppressed pistol not at Kaelen, but at Nyelle. Kaelen didn't raise his gun. Instead, he stepped directly into Quan's line of fire, shielding Nyelle with his own body. The dragon scales on his neck glistened under the cold fluorescent light, but his hands remained open and empty. For 30 years, his currency had been violence, a language of blood and brutality, but tonight he was speaking a different tongue. He felt the weight of 500 lives demanding not another death, but a sacrifice that would break the cycle. "If you want this land, you have to go through me," Kaelen said, his voice low and rough with a controlled fury that made the younger soldiers waver. He wasn't there to kill a rival boss with his bare hands anymore. He was there to become human. Quan fired. The suppressor made the gun cough, and Kaelen felt the savage precision of the bullet tear through his shoulder. He staggered, red blooming across his white shirt, but he didn't fall. He didn't even reach for the weapon at his waistband. He simply looked at his men he had raised after his father died, and chose to bleed for the innocent rather than command them to kill for him. "I signed the budgets that destroyed your families," Kaelen rasped, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps as he forced himself to remain standing. "I won't let you sign this one." The sight of the Dragon of Seattle refusing to strike back acted like a kill switch on their resolve. One by one, the scarred knuckles of his enforcers loosened and their weapons lowered. Kaelen slumped against the mahogany table, his vision blurring, but he knew the vipers had lost their fangs. He had shaken the ground not with a blow, but with a surrender that finally restored his soul. Kaelen leaned heavily against the mahogany table, his white shirt now a canvas of crimson, but his focus remained on Nyelle. Through the haze of pain, he saw her fingers flying across the laptop keys with surgical speed, her face illuminated by the sharp glow of the screen. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the prodigy who could see the lies buried in the numbers, and now she was using those same numbers to execute a different kind of justice. "The offshore accounts are open," Nyelle whispered, her voice steady even as the rain hammered the glass of the farmhouse windows. Guided by her fierce, intelligent urgency, Kaelen began the process of fourfold restoration. With each keystroke, the billion-dollar empire his father had built with blood and brutality began to dissolve into something better. First, they targeted the Harton farm, using the same shadow subsidiaries his uncle had used to bleed the syndicate. Kaelen moved millions to satisfy the widow's debts, ensuring her legacy was no longer a line item in a vulture's ledger. But it didn't stop there. Nyelle mapped the flow of the stolen funds, identifying every family and small business that the Dragon of Seattle had crushed during his 8-year reign. Kaelen felt a profound inner collapse that had nothing to do with his wound as he authorized the transfers. He watched the digital numbers, once used for international equipment transfers and money laundering algorithms, reroute toward community grants, medical funds for the uninsured, and restitution for the families of his victims. It was a Trojan horse of restoration. While his uncle's network waited for the Viper logistics payday, Kaelen was systematically burning the digital infrastructure to fund a new future. "You're losing everything," Nyelle noted, looking up from the screen with eyes that saw more than the dragon. "I'm keeping my soul," Kaelen replied, his voice low and rough. The sharp, metallic tang of desperation that had defined the boardroom was gone, replaced by the earthy scent of the stew and the quiet, mechanical hum of a debt being paid. For 30 years he had been a predator, but in this remote cabin of glass and dark wood he was finally learning to be human. As the sun began to rise behind thick clouds, turning the world gray and gold, the viper's nest was dismantled, not with a gun, but with the truth that only Nyelle could see. The gray morning light filtered through the barred windows of the city, turning the world watercolor and vague. Kaelen Morrix sat on the edge of the bed, no longer a predator in an expensive suit, but a man carrying a weight he finally knew how to set down. Beside him, Nyelle Harton held the laptop that contained the digital ruins of the PHANUEL'S syndicate. Every name, every dirty dollar, and the full evidence of the organ-harvesting nightmare they had dismantled together. "It's time," Kaelen said, his voice low and rough, sounding like ice over deep water. He reached out and took Nyelle's hand. His palm was no longer slick with the metallic tang of desperation, but steady with a purpose he hadn't felt in 30 years. He had already authorized the kill switch, erasing the digital infrastructure of his father's empire and ensuring that the vultures like Mel and Oren would find nothing but ashes. Avon Lior, the enforcer known for a justice that couldn't be bribed, waited in the lobby of the federal facility. As Kaelen walked toward him, he didn't look like the dragon of Seattle who had killed a rival boss with his bare hands. He looked like a man who had finally chosen to become human. He handed over the encrypted drive, the Trojan horse of truth that would prosecute his uncle's entire network. "I'm here to cut a deal," Kaelen stated, his eyes meeting Avon's with a fierce, intelligent honesty. "I give you the names, the locations, and the bank accounts. In exchange, I want immunity for the soldiers who flipped and a second chance for the victims we saved." As the handcuffs clicked shut, Kaelen felt a strange, light freedom. The empire of blood was gone, replaced by a new covenant of restoration. 6 months later, the man who had been a dragon sat in a sparse visitation room, wearing civilian clothes and a shorter, lighter haircut. He had a new name, a Michael, born from the ashes of Morrix, living in a small town where the air tasted like pine and possibility. He looked at Nyelle across the table and smiled, a genuine smile, the first she'd ever seen, and promised her a date in a future where they were both truly free. The healing had begun.